here as well. That's going to be an interesting match to follow because he also plays online. So I think gone are the days where players are really having a big discrepancy between their maybe in-person chess and online. At the same time, by pedigree, you got to think that guys like Hans and Lazovic and Grishuk, they have the most online results and experience out of the group so far.
That's right. We're getting into this match right here, round number 4, and immediately can start talking about this opening, which is definitely a unique one. White usually starts with e4 or d4, the most common moves in chess. But apart from that, once in a while you'll get knight f3 or c4, and we kind of see a combination of both here. And if we're thinking about this position reversed, we're kind of playing a Benko gambit, which is usually an opening for the black pieces, but we're seeing it now from White's perspective. And it's not the first time in this event that we've kind of had this discussion about openings that you usually see for black, now with an extra tempo played with White. And usually it's openings that don't have the best reputation that you see people trying with White because they think, okay, maybe I can make that extra move matter.
Absolutely, that extra move in a position like this, you compare to Benko gambit, maybe White goes for an early break with e3. Normally you play d3 and then you challenge the center. We're going to see that here, but David Anton, he's an ambitious player. He likes complication. He's got an interesting repertoire. Hopefully he's armed with some ideas here as to, look, I'm playing a reverse Benko gambit. I'm giving black quite a bit of space in the center. You see that pawn on d4 supported by c5 and e5. And as long as it stays there, your bishop on b2 is kind of frustrated. So oftentimes, let's say as White here, you're looking for a way to chip away at that. That might be f4 in some instance, might be or e3.
From g5 back to the e4 square. What was unusual for me is, well, e3 made sense, but I'm surprised that David Anton also included queen to e2 instead of maybe castling, because now I don't really feel as comfortable capturing on d4, and e4, it's not really how I'm used to seeing this continue.
No, this has some shades of the King's Indian structure, where it feels like the White is banking on either moving the knight and placing on f5, or moving the knight and maybe castling and playing on f4. But there's been some ways to try from both colors. I mean, the bishop on b2 is not a very happy piece. So Hans is probably pretty happy with the position. Like, I think objectively, this black is more than comfortable. But it's pretty and the position is going to open up at some point. White wants to play f4 at a good moment. And we have opposite side castling, so very likely pretty soon. Like the tension rises in the position. necessarily attack the queen side. He's just placing his pieces on good squares and adopting the attitude, look, you might eventually play f4. I'm okay with it. That will give me some counterplay as well. I got the rook on e8, looking at that that pawn on e4. But still, I think the onus is a bit on David Anton to demonstrate, look, you want to push on the king side, you want to attack on this king on g8. What's that going to look like? Is it going to be the h pawn? Is it going to be the g pawn? Or maybe we're going to have gridlock here, and the players are going to be shuffling quite a bit, waiting for one another to make the first move. First move meaning like, yeah, white's break is that f2 pawn eventually going to f4. Black, if he really feels like it, could play f5 at some moment, opening up towards the center. Even though his king is on that side, if he evaluates it as like, look, I can do that and I still don't see how I get attacked, that's a way to make progress and challenge the position.
That's right. I'm interested to see what Hans is going to do to continue. One of the things about moving this knight makes perfect sense to not play bishop on e2 to c1. But I was going to say, one of the things about this knight is maybe you do have to be careful on the string of bishop to some kind of level. It's probably a little bit early for that right now, but I do think it should be kept in mind. You can't just shuffle all your pieces away from the queen side because that can sacrifice it.
We can trade queens, but if you don't want to trade queens, your knight is stuck on f3, and if your knight's stuck on f3, well, you can't move your f2 pawn, and then the options for white to actually open up on the king side are lacking.
Yep, exactly right. We see a few more decisions here. Bishop d2, and then the bishop retreats. Now the knight on b1, I was about to say, cannot use the d2 square. Now, in a position like this, how ambitious do you want to be? Because we've just seen not necessarily an official offer, but we did just see repetition of moves. So it made me think, if it's on offer, if there is a draw available, would you want to take it?
Yeah, it looks like there could be this bishop a5, bishop c7 repetition. I don't think Hans minds it, but he might prolong the game a little bit, hoping for white to take some unnecessary risk. It's sometimes like one of those cases where you're both open to repeating, but you don't want to be the one offering the repetition or leading the repetition. So there might be, just a little bit of flirting happening here with the pieces. Like, I want you to initiate the draw. No, I want you to do it. But I don't think from the position itself and the clocks, which are very balanced right now, that either player feels they have a strong position or one that they need to go all out in. But if the queens get traded, then I could see Hans maybe pushing to pawn to f5, and I very much like this exchange. That dark squared bishop of blacks was decent, but trades off for knight, which is a tricky piece, and white's dark squared bishop I'm not a big fan of. So this imbalances the position. It doesn't necessarily allow black any more options to break through on the queen side or something like that, but you see the weakness of white is the d3 pawn, which is hard to access, and that dark squared bishop that white has does not support those pawns whatsoever. So I could see some future where black will eventually play f5 and utilize both knights to put pressure on e4 and on the center structure. And in the meantime, white has to figure out how to actually make use of this bishop on d2.
Yeah, it does look like the move f4, even g4 can both be played next. I've been getting this feeling, even though we're definitely equal, I'm getting this feeling the entire game, like white can decide when things open up. They can decide when f4 is played, decide when to expand with g4. And if you're the one that sort of holds all the cards there, it feels like you can never be worse.
No, I think you're right there. And that's a couple of decisions. Maybe I'm a little surprised Hans went into this, even though I did think he was going for a queen trade. As black, I want to make sure this bishop on d2 does not become an impactful piece. And f4 seems to finally be ready. Doesn't mean that bishop is still going to be really good. But there's a future where that bishop can harass the h6 pawn, the b6 pawn, some of the black's pawns on dark squares. It really depends on how we evaluate the eventual f4 move that white is going to have to play. Yeah, we want to open up.
Might be next. Could be the very next move that we see. There's also ideas like, okay, it's just play g4. I was thinking about other moves. Look, if you play h5, yes, you might sort of get the structure you want, but it's going to close up with g5. You can't really play the game with absolutely everything closed. So obviously f4.
There's a trickier one. If you go rook f6 and I go rook f2 and you play knight e6, I bishop takes h6, followed by g5. Hans could block right here at knight e5, but just for example, looking at knight e5, because there was little time there, he does stay alert, and white has to stay alert too, because the knight e5 is pinned right now, but in some positions where the rook's not pinned, can take on c4, preparing this d3 fighting the king and the rook if white isn't careful.
Yeah, it means that probably okay, takes. I have to say I'm a little bit surprised by that. I was actually really liking the dark square bishop, and maybe just the fact that I didn't really pull this black onto dark squares being targeted. But when I see a move like that, it kind of indicates to me that he's okay with the draw.
I think so. One feature of the position that might not come into place is e4 pawn blocks. If the knights could just move on forever, white would eventually move the knight to the b2 square. Get to d1, get to b2, pick that off, that'd be fantastic. But the rooks would have to be off the board to really pull that off, and black's knight would have to be contained, which I don't see happening yet. But it still is a feature. That's the one pawn of black's that's not supported in the position. And now white also has that on h4, but maybe white's looking to play h5, get rid of that, and maybe put a bit of pressure on the king side. But with limited material, it still feels fairly equal here. I don't see any serious weakness for either player that can be exploited. But again, with a rook on g5, you have ideas of rook d5. Why rook d5? You want to provoke an exchange, take with the maybe c pawn, get a passed pawn, and bring your knight to c4. So with no increment chess, position can be equal. These guys get down to 2 minutes. Doesn't matter if it's equal or not. Mistakes are going to happen, and concessions are going to have to be made for the purposes of staying afloat on the clock.
Yeah, knight to h7, so the knight is coming to the f6 square next potentially, but if the rook goes backwards, let's say to g3, g1, then you could start to think about playing rook to e5 as Hans, and then maybe rook to h5, and the h4 pawn becomes a target.
So we see this rook d5 move. Hans quickly responds. He doesn't want to give white a protected passed pawn or a good square for the knight. It's getting sharp again because David Anton's rook has made it on from g5 to d5 to d8. It can
Yep.
swing behind the a4 pawn. It can attack the b6 pawn from behind. And h4 is white's main weakness. The knight can just slide over to f3 and defend it. So as of right now, it might seem like white has a few ideas to attack black. Meanwhile, black needs to figure out counterplays. He can go for passive counterplay, defend b6 with a knight on d7 or something, or look for something more active. But a critical moment in this game right now.
Yep, he is going to go for defense, and I think that's going to involve rook e6 here because rook b8 is far too passive, and it's making me wonder, are we in for a repetition with rook d8 and rook e8 because there's not really other moves available. White's rook doesn't really have anywhere else to go. You could consider rook c6, but black's king can start to make the journey. King h6, king h5, and king takes h4 if you're not careful.
I think that's exactly why white isn't just rushing to go into an endgame. Is yes, a4 is weak. Yes, maybe b6 can be weak, but it's the black's weaknesses. And that's a crazy decision or a very risky decision to make without proper calculation. And Hans, not repeating knight h5. That is interesting. He's probably saying, look, you can win the a4 pawn, but my rook goes to f6 and it starts harassing the knight on h2. It can start harassing the pawn on h4, or even getting behind, harassing white's king and putting pressure on the d3 pawn. At the d3 pawn, that is the biggest pawn to lose because that's the base of all of white's pawns, and then the rest will fall. So Hans showing ambition here, not repeating moves, I admire that because it's not an easy decision to make.
I'm looking at that a4 pawn, and well, first of all, the king on c1 seems peculiar to me because after knight f4, it's only going to be subject to knight e2 or knight d3. And speaking of knight e2, that's kind of what I wanted to do. Knight f4, knight e2, knight c3, and I feel like I can really start to target that a pawn, and actually black's a pawn remaining alive could actually go all the way.
Yeah. Often in these races, the most advanced pawn makes a difference. Here, Hans gives a check so that he can play king f6, because when rook was on f2, it would have run into a knight g4 fork. So it's going to be a race for the weaknesses. b6 is weak, a3 is weak. This is heading towards a decisive game, but Hans is down 30 seconds, Amon.
I don't think he likes his own decision of giving that check and bringing the king out, because after that knight check, all of a sudden he's the first one to face a devastating loss of one of the pawns. So he's committed. He has to go f5.
He has to go f5, and he has to allow rook b7 check and probably put his king on the back rank. Don't be too fooled by the eval bar. Clock is important, and the players are no means in a situation to play perfectly with play on both sides of the board. Just pure instincts here.
And you can take on g6 as well next with check. b6 is hanging. Black does have maybe arguably the best pawn at the moment on d4, but that's it.
Knight d3, I guess king c7. And, knight, okay, he takes g6, as you mentioned. That e-pawn can run pretty quickly, Amon. It can go e5, e6, e7. It's very close to queening, and Hans is going to have to play very accurately here based on his clock situation to hold things. He's got his own d-pawn.
It's going to be a race, right? The e-pawn is going, like, once you get e6, e7, e8, unstoppable. But if king d3 right now, rook f3, knight e4, d3, black is making the exact same threats.
So d3, he's repeating right now?
I think it might have to be. It's right at the moment where it just could explode into a loss for either player. They're probably both looking at the clock right now saying, okay, 30 seconds, is this really worth staking everything?
Knight e4 is such a fascinating move to prepare d3 and rook f1 mate. You might repeat instead, but it's a scary race.
Who knows? Different day. You might really be interested in knight e4 and d3, maybe in a like penultimate round or something, but they decide to play it cool, and with only 30 seconds left, they end peacefully with a draw.